Sacred teachings are transformative and operate totally differently than how we think of traditional scientific and philosophical theories operating. If science and philosophy are thought of as abstract systems, logically linking lifeless concepts into a coherent explanatory framework, then they couldn't be further from that which we speak of as a sacred teaching. But if science and philosophy are conceived as theories that do not merely explain the facts, but elicit and bring forth the facts that they seek to explain, then suddenly we find ourselves in the domain of the alchemical theoria, with which Jung concerned himself, to a philosophy and science whose mode of understanding corresponds to an act of presence that makes present what is concealed and hidden, to a mode of understanding that radically transforms the life of the one who so understands. Jung observed that alchemy was always a kind of mystic philosophy, and understood in this light, we ourselves can understand Jung's work itself as a kind of mystical philosophy. Jung consistently went to great lengths to present himself as a traditional empiricist, carefully and soberly tallying the facts and advancing a theory, not to be hypostatized into the domain of metaphysics, but hypothetically postulated to explain the psychological phenomena with which he was concerned. Jung worked hard behind the scenes to avoid the association of his work with mysticism and spirituality, a maneuver that many of his followers would take up for him as well, in order to preserve his scientific reputation. Yet it is abundantly clear that despite Jung and his followers' attempts to cover over the mystical dimension of his work by claiming that he was just doing science, the mystical and spiritual source that his work springs from irradiates from almost every page. To reduce Jung to a theorist and empirical scientist is to totally miss the point. To see what is going on here, it's helpful to bear in mind a distinction Jung made throughout his life between what he called his number one and number two personalities. As Peter Kingsley points out, Jung's notion of the number one and number two personalities link up in perfect and exquisite alignment with the idea of two different spirits already introduced by him right at the start of his Red Book, the spirit of this time and the spirit of the depths. The spirit of this time corresponds to the number one personality, which covers over, represses, and hides away the intuitions and impulses of the spirit of the depths. The spirit of this time would like to hear of use and value. It changes with generations, always fascinated with what is new, current, trending. It is concerned with its worldly engagements, with reputation and status. It's motivated by pride and arrogance and parades its knowledge, which is really only a facade and pretense to cover over its insecurity and doubt. The spirit of the depths, on the other hand, corresponds to the number two personality and speaks beyond justification, use, and meaning, and from time immemorial and for all the future possesses a greater power than the spirit of this time. Behind the number one personality that likes to play the part of the empirical scientist is the number two, primordial and archaic. Jung would at times refer to this number two personality as the natural mind. He writes, "That is the sort of mind which springs from natural sources, and not from opinions taken in books. It wells up from the earth like a natural spring, and brings with it the peculiar wisdom of nature." As Jung describes his experience of it, there was always deep in the background the feeling that something touched me, or as if a spirit had invisibly entered the room, the spirit of one who had long been dead, and yet was perpetually present in timelessness until far into the future. Jung notes, "In my life, number two has been of prime importance, and I have always tried to make room for anything that wanted to come to me from within. He is a typical figure, but he is perceived only by the very few." It is against this background that we have to see Jung's insistence that all he was doing was empirical science, for this is the image that his number one personality liked to hold up as the reflection of the spirit of this time, that which could be of use and value. As Kingsley states, almost everywhere it's on the most brilliant and ostentatious display. But if Jung's so-called science is only a paper-thin veneer covering over the true meaning of his work, then how are we to understand its deeper, esoteric strata? Another claim that Jung often liked to make, without any explicit justification, was that what he was doing was phenomenology, superficially conceived as a method that brackets any claim to metaphysical or ontological reality, and simply reports how things show up in experience. In one sense, Jung certainly does do this, but in another it totally misses the point of his phenomenological method. But we should take Jung seriously when he says that what he is doing is phenomenology. More precisely, that what he is engaged in is a phenomenological hermeneutic that opens up an experiential field in which the deeper meaning of psychological phenomena can be discerned. Jung is engaged in the hermeneutical task of uncovering the dream that the unconscious continues to dream through us. And just as Jung consistently saw dreams as texts whose meanings must be interpreted in order to render them intelligible, so too must appearances, psychological phenomena, encounters with the unconscious, be interpreted. While Jung left us only scant remarks of what this phenomenology consisted of, we can begin to discern how it is employed by turning to the phenomenological hermeneutics of a kindred spirit, Henry Corbin. Corbin, a scholar of Arabic and Persian philosophy and esoteric religion, introduced to the West a profound understanding of Islamic spirituality, and was also the first translator of Heidegger's Sein und Zeit in French. His phenomenological hermeneutics can help illuminate Jung's engagement with alchemical and Gnostic texts, for it reveals that the understanding Jung achieved in interpreting such texts corresponds to an achievement at the level of being, to an act of presence. Corbin writes, "The link to which phenomenology draws our attention is the indissoluble link between modi intelligendi and modi essendi, between modes of understanding and modes of being. The modes of understanding are essentially in accordance with the modes of being. Any change in the mode of understanding is necessarily concomitant with a change in the mode of being. The modes of being are the ontological, existential, or existentiating conditions of the act of understanding, of verstehen, which is to say, of hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the definite task set before the phenomenologist." The different levels of the modi intelligendi as verstehen, understanding, are the different hermeneutical levels from which understanding can be advanced and are conditioned by different modes of being, modi essendi, which are their respective supports or mediums. To understand a text is to be present, through an active present, to that level of being from which the work was advanced. Understanding as verstehen is inseparable from the presencing of a distinct mode of being, and consists in unveiling and in bringing the hidden meaning, occulted beneath the outward appearance, beneath the phenomenal, out into manifestation, causing the true meaning itself, initially occulted by that which is apparent, to emerge into manifestation. Through the act of understanding, what is latently present in the apparent is unveiled in its presence manifestly. As Corbin notes, the Arabic term that most closely corresponds to hermeneutics is tawil, meaning to reconduct something to its source, to its archetype. Not a mere intellectual operation, but rather the opening up and shining forth of what is concealed in the apparent. The modi intelligendi, the theoria, elicits and brings to presence that which is understood. Corbin writes, "It consists of the occultation of the apparent and the manifestation of the occulted," and further adds, "Nor did the alchemists themselves conceive otherwise of their own great work." And is this not precisely how a Jungian text operates, conducting the appearances back to their archetypes? While Jung never clearly articulated this phenomenological method, it is not very difficult to see it at work in his texts. The alchemical theoria is a hermeneutical key, a clavis hermeneutica, that opens all the locks, that close access to the veiled, to the occulted, to the esoteric. And the key is the principal tool with which the phenomenologist's mental laboratory is equipped. Corbin writes, "We are dealing with modes of understanding, modi intelligendi, proceeding from occulted modes of being, modi essendi. The mode of being at which Jung truly understood alchemical texts corresponds to the mode of being of the number 2 personality, the spirit of the depths. The spirit of the depths, irradiating intuitions of its archaic meaning. Jung's interpretations correspond to a totally different mode of being than that with which empirical science concerns itself, a mode of being welling up from the earth like a natural spring, the peculiar wisdom of nature. To adopt the alchemical theoria is to prepare for a profound upwelling of spirit, and to truly understand through this modi intelligendi is to be transformed, transfigured." We can begin to see how Jung went about conducting the appearances back to their archetypal source by following his analysis of three key terms appearing in alchemical texts: spirit, soul, and body. Spirit, Jung notes, comes from the Latin spiritus, which was a subtle, volatile, active, and vivifying essence. As breath, it was thus connected to the Greek pneuma, which Jung sees as connoting air in motion, a gaseous state of aggregation. As air, it is a spirituale corpus, a spiritual body, thus showing that the early conception of spirit expresses the contamination of two separate realms, spirit and matter. What on the primitive level was felt as an invisible, breath-like presence, always an active, winged, swift-moving being, as well as that which vivifies, stimulates, incites, fires, and inspires, a dynamic principle which, through later developments, would lead to its opposition to nature and body, which in comparison seemed inert, lifeless, and dead. The archaic spiritus approaches from the outside, but with increasing developments gets lodged in man's consciousness and becomes a subordinate function, thus apparently forfeiting its original autonomy. As the spirit is further identified with man's psyche, it loses its autonomous character, leading to the gravest danger of thinking that he actually created the spirit and that he has it. In reality, however, the primordial phenomenon of the spirit takes possession of him. To free the spiritus, spirit must be differentiated from our human intentions and plans, restored to its autonomy, freed to do its work, conducted back to its archetypal source. To the medieval psyche, the spiritus is the spiritus mundi, the spirit which rules nature, and the degree to which modern consciousness sees itself as lord of nature indicates the degree to which it has become possessed by it. If our scientific and philosophical theories are seen as the ingenuity of the spirit of man, the ordering principle in man that sets to work, bringing into coherent relation the chaos of nature, then we can already see how far we've strayed from the archaic meaning of spirit, for it is not man that truly orders and creates, not the number one personality, but the spirit of the depths, that breath-like presence that resists our attempts to capture it in logical or formulaic systems. A totally different kind of knowing is needed, an alchemical theoria, to hear its voice and call. What then of the term soul? Jung notes that the word comes from the Latin anima and the Greek psyche, and is a term often connected or equated with spiritus, representing the life principle. Jung writes, its essential characteristic is to animate and be animated, as can be seen in the Greek psychein, meaning to breathe, to blow. Jung writes, soul is the living thing in man, that which lives of itself and causes life. The German Seele is closely related to the Gothic form Saihualo, and thus to the Greek aiolos, something like a butterfly, psyche in Greek, which reels drunkenly from flower to flower and lives on honey and love. Clearly, not the dogmatic conception of the soul so many of us are accustomed to, but that being, with her cunning play of illusions, that lures into life the inertness of matter that does not want to live, full of snares and traps, in order that man should fall, should reach the earth, entangle himself there, and stay caught, so that life should be lived. He writes, it is something that makes us live. It is a life behind consciousness that cannot be completely integrated with it, but from which, on the contrary, consciousness arises. Everything the anima touches becomes numinous, unconditional, dangerous, taboo, magical. Soul, then, too, functions autonomously. The more we come to identify with the soul, the more we lose sight of it, the more we hinder its ethereal fluttering, and thus lose touch with the very ground that makes our conscious lives possible. And not only is psyche that which lies behind consciousness, the ground from which consciousness arises, she is also that which lures matter, corpus, into animation, and is thus a life-giving power like a glue, holding the world together and standing in the middle between body and spirit. An anima media natura, the soul is the middle nature. the physiological reaction that joins spirit to body, corpus and spiritus, joined together by a third, anima, as ligamentum corporis et spiritus, the bond of body and soul. Jung writes, one can only conclude that the unconscious tends to regard spirit and matter not merely as equivalent, but as actually identical, that spirit and matter may well be forms of one and the same transcendent being. Clearly, we are no longer in the domain of modern empirical science, but have passed into a concealed mode of being where both spirit and matter obey their own unique laws, not grasped through mechanized science or formal logic, but by way of a subtle knowing capable of seeing into the heart of the universe. This form of knowing was achieved by certain alchemists who conceived of their matter not as dead and inert, but alive, animated by the active and vivifying breath of spirit and soul. The chemical transformation wrought by the alchemists in the materia implicates the alchemist him or herself in the transformation, for the materia was alive, forms of one and the same transcendent being, a subtle body simultaneously spiritual and corporeal, lured into life by the alchemists' operations, their incantations, we might say, and awakened from its slumbering latency. And the awakening of that latent spirit was simultaneously the awakening of the spirit in the alchemist, the activation of the psychic background upon which their conscious life depends, an eruption of the archetypal ground into consciousness. The chemical transformations of the materia, informed by spirit and soul, awaken an intelligible unfolding that simultaneously activates this unfolding in the operator. The transformation requires both alchemist and materia, their relation, a new relation of a third kind, a subtle body that now flits between the two, opening up the mysterious depths of both spirit and matter. This is why the alchemist would speak of the chemical combination of bodies, of both subtle and material bodies, as drawn together by affinity. The bodies to be combined were to be married, and were conceived of as opposites, the masculine agens instigating the transformation, the feminine patiens undergoing the change, roles that could be reversed, operator transforming materia, materia transforming operator, spiritual body transforming corporeal body, corporeal body transforming spiritual body. The bodies, desirous of each other, speak to the profound and concealed centrality of instinctual life. The relation of opposites is further amplified through the arising of theremorphic images in the opus, dog and bitch, stallion and donkey, cock and hen, eruptions of unconscious instincts seeking their goal, grasped through a form of knowing characterized by visionary imagination, arising from an organ of sight surpassing the sight of the optical organ, yet including it, which symbolizes the otherwise incomprehensible interplay of spirit and matter, an organ capable of symbolizing ontological truths not otherwise accessible to the discursive intellect, a faculty, as we shall see, of the heart, capable of feeling and sensing the latent unity concealed in the chaos of the materia and drawing it out into its manifest state. The key to Jung's phenomenological hermeneutics and to the theoria of the alchemists is the imagination, whose knowing is simultaneously the experiencing of what is known, not a whimsical pastiche of fantasy images, but an epistemological organ capable of bringing into presence what lies concealed in the appearances. As we read in the Rosarium, "And take care that thy door be well and firmly closed, so that he who is within cannot escape, and God willing, thou wilt reach the goal. Nature performeth her operations gradually, and indeed I would have thee do the same. Let thy imagination be guided wholly by nature, and observe according to nature, through who the substances regenerate themselves in the bowels of the earth, and imagine this with true and not with fantastic imagination." Jung comments, "The imaginatio is to be understood here as the real and literal power to create images, Einbildungskraft, imagination, the classical use of the word in contrast to fantasia, which means a mere conceit, in the sense of insubstantial thought. Imaginatio is the active evocation of inner images secundum naturam, according to nature, an authentic feat of thought or ideation, which does not spin aimless fantasies into the blue, but tries to grasp the inner facts and portray them in images true to their nature. This activity is an opus, a work. And further, Jung comments, we have to conceive of these processes not as the immaterial phantoms we readily take fantasy pictures to be, but as something corporeal, a subtle body, semi-spiritual in nature. While Jung was elusive in articulating this view outright, the implications are clear. The product of the work of the alchemist was a conjunctio of subtle and material bodies, which presented itself as an immediate psychic phenomenon, and was experienced as an encounter with the not yet human anthropoid disposition which we also call the unconscious. What Jung called the unconscious was not a hypothetical postulate that merely gives an account of the facts, but an experience of that invisible, breath-like presence that was once referred to as spiritus and psyche, accessed through a form of knowing whose organ is the true imagination, which pierces straight through the dichotomies of the discursive intellect, revealing the latent unity of spirit and matter, the dark psychic background from which consciousness arises and holds us within its grip. We are not dealing here with a mere theory, but a theoria, a phenomenological hermeneutic that elicits and brings forth the psychic background into conscious experience. This theoria is not simply an abstract system of thought, but the route to the ground out of which any system of thought can arise in the first place, and whose function is thus to elicit the transformations in the operator, him or herself, which it sought to explain. But what does it mean that the unconscious is not yet human and also anthropoid? If the unconscious is not like the other objects and subjects we encounter in the world, but the very possibility of encountering subjects and objects to begin with, how are we to understand it? Jung writes, man thinks of himself as holding the psyche in the hollow of his hand. He dreams even of making a science of her, but in reality she is the mother and maker, the psychical subject and even the possibility of consciousness itself. The psyche reaches so far beyond the boundary line of consciousness that the latter could be easily compared to an island in the ocean. While the island is small and narrow, the ocean is immensely wide and deep, so that if it is a question of space, it does not matter whether the gods are inside or outside. If the unconscious is the possibility of consciousness itself, its mother and maker, then any attempt to theorize the unconscious is already conditioned by the unconscious itself. So how can we say anything about the unconscious if whatever we say about it is already determined by it? Apparently, it's not a thing that can be reached in the usual way, but requires a theoria that activates the visionary imagination capable of getting to the heart of the matter. What Jung referred to as the unconscious was already known to our archaic ancestors, which is why Jung often referred not to the discovery of the unconscious, but to its rediscovery. And it's not hard to locate in Jung's writing, where in antiquity Jung found its articulation. We find numerous references to the thoroughly Pythagorean Timaeus of Plato, whose striking image of the chora serves as the space or receptacle in which the forms, the divinely instituted archetypes that condition and order intelligible and perceptible worlds, are received, and is likened to the mother or receptacle of what has come to be, apprehended through a dreamlike non-thinking, the creative matrix or womb out of which becoming unfolds. Jung's references to the crater or vessel of the corpus hermeticum, as well as a uterus of spiritual renewal and rebirth, similarly situates us, as the hermetist's nous is itself likened to a womb that discloses the things that are, a state anterior to knowing, but realized nevertheless through symbolic transmission, through a creative or ontological function of imagination. What was well known to antiquity was lost to modernity, and Jung's rediscovery of the unconscious is an interpretive reintroduction of this faculty into the modern era disguised in the dress of modern empirical science. The unconscious is anterior to any explicit discursive formulation, and thus incapable of being held by such formulations. To come to an understanding of its reality, of its hyper-ontological reality, a different form of knowing is needed, an alchemical theoria, a phenomenological hermeneutic which in its act of knowing brings forth, draws from its latent to its manifest state what is known. Jung's phenomenological hermeneutic reconducts the appearances back to their archetypal source. The unconscious is not yet human in that it is the condition of anything becoming human at all, of taking on a human meaning, the very ground of our humanness, the anthropoid possibility of the human. As the condition of the possibility of anything human at all, it is the mother of what is and can only be grasped, as the Timaeus states, by a bastard form of reasoning. What is needed is a theoria that not only explains the facts, but in its instituting operation elicits the facts to be explained, brings them forth from their latent to their manifest state. It should be clear, then, that Jung's psychological theory is properly understood not as a theory of modern empirical science, but as a theoria, a transformative vehicle by way of which the relevant phenomena are made manifest, precisely aligned with the alchemical theoria, which can be traced right back to the earliest roots of our civilization. The mystery of matter the alchemists were investigating, armed with the alchemical theoria, activated the symbolic unconscious, the psychic background that conditions the possibility of any experience at all, the simultaneously spiritual and material contents of the imaginatio drawn or elicited into the unknown nature of the object, instituting the dynamic movement from latency to manifestation of its spiritual body, its psychic background, the anterior spiritual body of the stone. Jung noted that alchemy was always a kind of mystic philosophy, and it should now be evident that Jung's psychology itself, too, was always a kind of mystic philosophy. Since the unconscious is not any particular object at all, but rather the ground of the becoming of subjects and objects, their womb, it cannot be located in any standard space or place, for it itself is space, the place or situs upon which any opening of a world becomes possible, the creative matrix or womb out of which the life of becoming emerges. It speaks the language of the imaginatio and thus symbolizes, joins, unites intelligible ground and emergent becoming. This union and intelligible unfolding the alchemists experienced in their materia as a symbolon, making manifest the secret connections between operator and materia, who now find themselves in an inextricable relationship which points right to the heart of the mystery of creation. As the alchemists descended deeper into the dark mystery of nature's womb, they were simultaneously lured into the dark mystery of their own psychic origin, and subsequently back to the ancient myth of the royal and divine marriage, to the symbol of the unio mystica, since, as a mythologian, it expresses the archetype of the union of opposites. In the next video in the series, we will explore the expression of this archetype in both alchemical literature and in the context of the transference. For as Jung saw it, the alchemical dream still lives on in the dark psychic recesses of modern persons. To undergo and grasp the import of the transference is to be taken back into the archaic roots that continue to stretch out and grow through our lives. Equipped with the alchemical theoria, we will be able to navigate their branching and twining into our own lives and into the life of the world we live in more generally. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing to the channel. I will be hosting a weekly reading group every Wednesday to explore these themes further. See details in the description to this video below and on the channel page. I hope to see you there. Be well, my friends.